This episode is brought to you in part by Sacred Rites and the John Templeton Foundation's funding of the Spirituality and the Ethics of Religious Borrowing Working Group. You can learn more at sacred-rites.org/Templeton-working-group. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Natalie Avalos back to the show. Natalie Avalos is an ethnographer of religion whose research examines contemporary indigenous religious life, healing historical trauma, and decolonization. A Chicana of Mexican Indigenous descent, born and raised in the Bay Area, Dr. Avalos is currently working on her manuscript titled Decolonizing Metaphysics, Transnational Indigeneities and Religious Refusal. Avalos studies how indigenous practitioners in the Denver metro area navigate the increasing use of indigenous plant medicine like ayahuasca and psilocybin by white Americans for wellness purposes. Our first episode together was published on August 21st, 2024, and we discussed a basic primer on indigenous plant medicines in that episode. On this episode, we pick up where we left off and expand into the topic of the Western psychedelic medicine industry and then broaden out to talking about ethics, colonial non-ethics versus relational ethics. Not only do we discuss relational ethics of indigenous plant medicines, but we also discuss the tendency in the West to focus on extractive relationships and individualism as opposed to relationships, collectiveness, and community. We talk about how our primarily individual pursuits in life, rather than community relationality, harm everyone in society. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Natalie Avalos. Dr. Natalie Avalos, welcome back to Classical Ideas.
So glad to be back, Greg. We had such a good conversation last time, so I'm really happy to do a part two.
I am too. I love having return guests because that rapport is there. The vibe is different, and it's just a really nice time to reacquaint with somebody that you've met in the past. And just to recap on that, for listeners, if you go back to the podcast episode on August 21st, 2024, you will find part one of this conversation where we talked a lot about indigenous plant medicines. So everybody, definitely, you don't have to go back to that at first. You can keep listening with us right now, but if you want to go back, it's a great one. What have you been up to since then in the last year and a half?
Yeah, that's a good question. Lots of writing, and I have since done more research, kind of talking to folks locally in the field. I went to the Big Maps conference, which is basically the psychedelic sciences conference in Denver last year, and I was really interested in writing more about the ethical distinctions between how indigenous people approach medicine versus Western approaches, and really trying to lay that out clearly because that's something that needs to be made more visible.
Mm. What are you working on with Sacred Rites? I know you're doing something with Liz Bucar and the Templeton Foundation. What's going on with that cohort project?
So that's such a fun group, and I'm so grateful that Liz invited me to be a part of it. You know, for her, her work has been on religious appropriation, religious borrowing. So she invited scholars to help her think through religious borrowing. What are some of the politics, ethics? What are some of the stakes of religious borrowing? And so I decided to write more about this very thing. Like, how do we think about what are the real stakes of quote unquote borrowing or using or engaging in the world of indigenous psychedelics, plant medicines, entheogens. What does it mean to do that? Like, what are the real impacts of it? And I basically produced another article thinking about it.
Wonderful. Is that the project that you sent over? You working on with me for
Yes.
me? Colonial non-ethics versus
Yes.
relational ethics in the
Yeah.
world of indigenous medicines. Um, I would love to know a little bit about what this piece is about because There's a lot going on in the world of Western psychedelic medicine in that industry. And I'm curious what you're noticing about that industry, the goals of that industry, et cetera.
Yeah.
What do people need to know about what's going on?
I think what's become much more clear to me is that so many people in this industry, whether they're working in terms of policy, whether they're therapists, whether they're researchers, many of them just have these incredibly good intentions. They
Mm,
want to help people. They want to help people heal. They want to empower people. They see that the trauma that we live with, especially in the West, is really profound and overwhelming. But they also are so focused. They think that the only way to navigate these medicines is by commodifying them and then selling them to people, practitioners, communities, the wellness industry. And really what we could see is a kind of emerging medical industrial complex because it's really a for-profit system. And on the one hand, while it seeks to help people heal, it also really wants to profit and sell people things. And that dynamic itself is so deeply antithetical to the way that Indigenous peoples would view and navigate these medicines. And so in this article, I really focus on relational ethics because I just want to make that disparity much more salient, right? That when we think about commodification, it's really about objectification. You really turn a medicine that in an indigenous context has personhood, sentience, consciousness. You try and turn it into a product. And that is not just offensive for indigenous peoples, they see it as epistemic violence. They also see it as metaphysical violence. And by metaphysical violence, I would say that you're actually harming a relative, right?
mm,
If this um, plant person has agency, has sentience, has intelligence, again, that's viewed as transcending that of human life. When you try and commodify it, you are deeply offending and alienating that medicine. And that in an Indigenous context, when I was at that MAPS conference and I write about this, I just heard voice after voice after voice of different Indigenous peoples. And of course, I was very happy to see that Indigenous voices were included. But the irony is that within the same conference, you have one panel that's totally focused on like, how can we package and sell this better? And an other that's, Indigenous peoples from throughout the Americas saying, if you do that, if you commodify it, you are bringing harm. You're going to sow harm in your own life. These
mm.
plant medicines are not necessarily neutral. You're playing with the metaphysical balance of the universe. And I think that can be really hard for Westerners to understand because we have been so steeped in scientific materialism, this idea that, well, the only thing that's real, is the material world. They don't fully understand the stakes, the real consequences of what that could mean. And some of these indigenous leaders and representatives were basically saying, the medicine could literally stop working. It could choose not to work with you and serve you anymore. And I think that's a really compelling reason to explore this issue further. Like, oh, let's stop and think about what we're doing here.
Yeah. Something that I'm hearing come through is that in the West, it seems more of an individual pursuit, whereas in indigenous communities, it seems like more of a community and relational pursuit.
Yes,
And it seems like there is a way that we are socialized slightly, like differently from a very young age. So
yeah.
if we think about this American settler society, the socialization influences of religion like Christianity, um, how does that shape the belief, like that religious life is primarily an individual pursuit rather than a community pursuit? Because I feel like there's a really two different ways to come at the indigenous plant medicines issue that you're talking about. One is from an individualization, and one is from more of a community and relational aspect. Can you kind of tease those apart for me?
Totally. And that's really the thrust of my article is that, in the West, we get so socialized into this individualism. And it's born out of two things, right? Both our kind of Christendom project, right? That's the imperial project that we've been socialized into. That's the imperial project that has basically laid claim to the Americas and has told us salvation is all about your individual relationship with the divine and with God, capital G, God, and that you yourself, part and parcel of that system is being conditioned into settler colonialism, which can only really exist and survive through extraction. And so you have to extract resources. It's like a hungry ghost, right? Like it eats up resources, persons, right? They become basically fuel, it's food. And it takes more and more resources to sustain itself. And so that's why people get conditioned into this system where not only is collectivity pathologized, you believe that as an individual, you have to compete with others for resources. You become a worker. You're no longer part of a larger community. If we think back to some of the antecedents to the colonial projects that took place in the Americas and look, at the in the 15, 1600s in England, the loss of the commons. We
Hmm.
have this estranged relationship to land where commoners used to be able to be self-reliant, basically live off the land. Well, no, you close off the land. That coerces people to become workers in a burgeoning industrial capitalist society. And you only see, your only way out is to try and become upwardly mobile. Work your way up this hierarchical ladder, right? And again, that puts you in a position where collectivity is totally obscured and estranged.
So bring in the plant medicines now, like about that, that socialization of individual pursuits rather than a community pursuit. How does that affect the use and of plant medicines, um, as far as like from the individual and the community pursuits?
Yeah, so in an indigenous context, your sense of self is so deeply relational. You cannot see yourself as a discrete individual in any way. Even in indigenous languages, there's a tendency for them to be verb-based. So you're always literally thinking in relation, right? Like you can't see yourself as like a discrete subject or even a discrete noun, right? And there are no like discrete objects. And so in this world, you are more socialized towards well, what does it mean to be accountable to the collective? What does it mean to be responsible to the collective? How is it that my individual action or the things that I choose to do, my vocation and my daily activity can somehow support the flourishing of the collective? And so medicine in this context, yes, you may be trying to address something that's happening for you on a personal level, but the larger arc of understanding there is that the more you're able to um, be in balance and be, thriving and living well, you want people to do this because then they can, in turn, support the mutual flourishing of the whole community. And that's something we talked about a little bit last time. Like, it just lends towards this goal of stewardship, right? You want to steward not just the human community, but the other than human community. And so the goals are so different. And
Hmm.
I think that's part of what's so difficult in the West to convey to folks because our conditioning is so, so deep. And we're, very, we're desperate for healing. We're so alienated. And the irony, of course, is that part of our existential crisis and pain is actually rooted in settler colonial relations, right? Living in a highly stratified society where you are extracting from indigenous peoples those that have been racialized. And that's really how settler colonialism can operate through like racial capitalism, right?
Mm.
You can only see those deemed as racialized others. They were in this system where deeming them as somehow less human, quote unquote primitive, less entitled to sovereignty and autonomy, that justifies their dispossession, that justifies their exploitation. And so that also creates, because we sometimes don't realize that in this system of racial capitalism, whiteness is invented.
Mm.
Whiteness is invented. And with that invention of whiteness, what some indigenous scholars would say, well, it produces what you'd call the white possessive, the
Mm.
sense of entitlement to the lands and resources of indigenous peoples, African peoples, other colonized peoples. And because this relationship becomes so naturalized, you think that you're entitled and can use their resources, their medicines, in whatever way you want, and there's no real consequences. Whereas, in my article, I'm trying to say there actually are very real material, but also metaphysical, immaterial consequences to this, and we can't ignore them.
Elaborate on those consequences. Tell me what happens if we don't take into consideration the perspectives of the community, of the relational. What are the consequences if like the individual pursuit is the sole pursuit?
Well, one great example from an indigenous scholar who was there at the Psychedelic Sciences um, conference, his name was Osiris Gonzalez, and he was essentially saying, these medicines, they can play with your mind.
Hmm.
And you may think you have full agency, but if you're going into a relationship with them without integrity, without respect, and you're trying to consume them as an object, they could probably actually make your mental health worse.
Hmm.
You could lose mental clarity. You can lose your sense of reality. And of course, we think, well, I guess that's a gamble that we all take when we use like psychedelic medicines. Yeah, it is. But we have to understand that the the world has a particular kind of logic. We could even think of them as, well, these are natural laws. And in
Hmm.
indigenous context, the natural law is you cannot receive without giving respect, giving gratitude, giving humility, even sacrificing something, of yourself in order to receive that assistance and help and guidance in a good way. And
Mm,
so I think that's one good example, and of course another is that, as I mentioned earlier, that these medicines could choose to turn away from us completely and withdraw their help and no longer be effective. And this was something that was shared by Maria Sabina decades ago in her autobiography, where she said, she was a woman that inadvertently was convinced, to share medicine with Westerners like Gordon Wasson and others. And she later regretted it, partly because she said, I noticed that the medicine did not work the same. It did not talk to me in the same way. It wasn't as potent.
mm.
And that's a very real consequence as well.
Mm. You mentioned Liz Buchar earlier, and she's been doing some work on what happens if we take things that were inspired by religion in some way and ignore the religious aspect of it. Are you seeing anything hopeful from the Western psychedelic medicine industry about incorporating any of the history or the important stuff from indigenous plant medicine history into their future goals? Like, is there anything good happening here, or is it purely extractive?
I, you know, I think what is good is that even though those indigenous voices are often operating as optics in these spaces, like psychedelic sciences, there are a lot of people listening and more people listening. And that part of what these indigenous leaders are trying to tell us is that extractive relationship, they're not trying to critique people for the sake of critique, but instead help people see you've been conditioned into an exploitive system and that this system harms you too. And I think that's potentially very fertile because, again, that's I like to think of whiteness as like having this double-edged sword.
Mm,
It's like on the one hand, it gives you this power and currency and privilege, you know. On the other, it has socialized so deeply into this alienating individualism, and you're so hungry for relationality, you're so hungry for community. And I think in this political moment, hearing what Indigenous leaders are saying of like, don't go down this route. Like choose another way. Like let us lead here. And um, as we lead, we will help you develop relationships based on integrity, based on care with these medicines. And that's the right, true way to go. Because if you don't do that, you may end up just harming yourself more. And I think, what's so loving about the Indigenous voices that are there, they're also essentially saying, how can we restore a kind of kinship between us all? And
mm,
if you're willing to give up your entitlement and your extractive attitude and your commodified urge, right? Um, and of course, what they're indicting is a system that is much bigger than just this industry, right? Like our whole Western imperial society is based on this system. But by indicting it and then highlighting it, my hope is that people will go, oh, wow, how can we actually restore a sense of relationship that's rooted in integrity, that's rooted in good faith, where we do um, put Indigenous leadership at the center of the way we're navigating these medicines and follow their advice, follow their feedback, and actually integrate it into our protocols, into our systems, into institutional knowledge in such a way that is actually deeply decolonizing and radically, potentially radically empowering for all of us.
Yeah. I mean, the first time I ever saw psilocybin with my own eyes, it was in a plastic container pulled out of a refrigerator in
Right.
shrink wrap in the Netherlands.
Yeah,
And so it was a commodity that was sold to me with cash, at a store.
yeah,
And there was no understanding for me of the history behind that product. It was just something that I stupidly entered into with absolutely no context or information whatsoever. So that is, I would say, the most common way to enter into those
totally,
types of situations. And it's
totally.
it's an overwhelming and kind of a scary thing to have no real ability to understand what's happening.
I think you raised such an important point too, Greg, that this system of racial capitalism and the basically the impetus to commodify um, these medicines, Westerners aren't given much of a choice.
Hmm.
And if anything, that reveals kind of, well, several things. One is the coercive nature of these commodified relations. We, they're forced upon us. We don't know how to exist outside of them because, um, we've essentially become subjects to them, right?
Mm.
And I include myself in this in the sense that was born and raised in the US, even though I have, I consider myself Chicana with Mexican and Mexican American heritage with indigenous ancestry from Mexico, but I've been socialized into the system too, right? And so it forces you to participate in exploitive processes. And I think that's the real epiphany moment too, where you're like, this doesn't feel right. I
Mm.
don't want to do this, I don't want to operate this way. What option do I have? And then you begin to think like, oh, there are indigenous people encouraging us to live differently with them, like restore relationships with them. And the more we can actually restore that relationality, that in itself is healing. Like
Mm.
that in itself is so liberating.
Yeah, and I love that you said that you had a similar entry sort of to me, like you were raised in the system, I was raised in the system, but you had an epiphany moment somewhere. I had sort of an epiphany moment, which was reckless and crazy. But do you remember like an epiphany moment for you where you realized specifically, like, holy smokes, I'm questioning this now. I'm curious about this intellectually, academically. What was that? Like that epiphany.
Yeah, this was probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was invited. Um, a local college, Naropa University, invited me to share some information, give a talk about Indigenous religious life and ethics, basically some of the ethics within it, because they were starting a psychedelic assisted therapy training program.
Mm.
And again, I think well-intentioned, but I went into it a little naive, like not quite sure what they were doing, what it was about. And as I was sitting through conversations with folks and learning more, I realized, oh boy, there's a whole industry that's about to boom around these medicines. And this is potentially really problematic and harmful. And how, you know, I, the thing that is so painful about living in a settler colonial system is that it can sometimes feel like there's no outside to it. Like, how do you get out? You know, what is the outside? And in particular, in this moment, I think people are seeing like the cracks. You know, they're seeing infrastructure failure. They're seeing like the way that the state is operating in rogue ways. You know, just the sheer imperial violence, the sheer extra legal violence directed at citizens, and the boon of this moment is that we can see the cracks in this system that had tried to convince us that it was totalizing, that it was all powerful. And actually, um, it's not. It's failing, it's
Mm,
crumbling. And that people themselves, on the one hand, well, those that are so desperate for, you know, some sort of existential release and relief and healing, they're also, I think, overlapping with those that feel incredibly politically powerless, right?
mm,
And that political powerlessness, I see them as interlinked, right? That we get socialized out of relationality, but we also get socialized out of our personal and collective agency. Because again, in an indigenous context, your sense of sovereignty, your sense of power, political power, is grounded in relationships. It's
mm,
like, well, we as a people are sovereign because the land is sovereign and we are stewards of these lands. And so it's through our compact with the lands and the other than human inhabitants in them that we see our shared political and sovereign power. Whereas in the West, you know, we think of political power as like our individual rights, our ability to vote, you know, getting involved in our local state politics, voting in federal elections, things like that. But I think what's become so clear to people is that that system has failed us like radically,
yeah.
radically.
Yeah, and the powerlessness that you're talking about, like I deeply, deeply feel it, which is why I do this show, so that I can
Yeah,
continue to make connections like this one that
yeah.
kind of break me out of that mold and get me to feel slightly less powerless because I can talk about certain things that push my mind in new directions, you know?
Totally. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about learning about relational ethics, right? Is that we can go in whiteness and racial capitalism, we could go, oh, wait a second. Whiteness, on the one hand, while it can give some folks a fair amount of privilege, access to, you know, property, access to epistemic and social power, material power. On the other, it's an illusion. It gives you this illusion that, oh, you are aligned with the wealthy elite class. Well, no, look at the radical disparity between the radical elite class, like the very wealthy elite class, and everyday Americans. Like everyday Americans are actually much more, they have much more in common with the dispossessed than they realize, and not just in the US, but in the global South. And I think that class consciousness, that's really what racialization and racial capitalism seeks to obscure, right? It really seeks to obscure that realization like, oh, we collectively are being exploited, not just the colonized, right? Not just indigenous peoples, not just migrants, not just, you know, refugees, etc. Um, and having that epiphany is so powerful because you realize, oh, I can work in solidarity with them. And
Mm,
when I work in solidarity with them and get involved in, you know, local forms of mutual aid, community groups that are trying to protect people from illegal deportation, right? Community groups that are trying to resource those that are refugees. When I plug into these systems and networks of care, I'm actually deconditioning myself from that system of racial capitalism. I'm deconditioning myself from this system that says, um, a stratified society is a good thing and that it works because we know it doesn't work. It only serves the very, very wealthy. It has failed to serve us for generations. And really it was built to give you the illusion that it even served you anyway, right? And so I think the real power is seeing through that, disinvesting from that system, right? Racialization, misogyny, transphobia, all of that propaganda, seeing through it and going, oh, these, all the people in my community, these are my people. This is my
Yeah.
community. How can I work with them to actually build relational power? And through that relational power, build a very different world and take back power.
Yeah. Well, I love how this is like a conversation about like indigenous plant medicines, but it's also like that is just like one example
Yeah,
of ways that the world, like we have been told to extract things from the earth and to make it an individualized pursuit for the sake of profit. But
right.
it's just like a teeny tiny little snapshot of all of the examples of the ways that we've been conditioned to extract
Totally. Whether
from the
it's
earth.
fossil fuel, right, or other minerals that we're using for tech, and looking at the violence happening in Sudan, looking at the extraction in parts of Latin America, like the Congo, et cetera. Like these are all interconnected, and I feel like almost every generation has that epiphany around imperialism, and it's like, oh. Oh, wait, we are pawns in an imperial war that's, we don't necessarily, we're benefiting from in a small way, but I think what's become more clear is that, for Westerners, that the exchange is almost like you exchange your soul, and
Yeah.
you don't want to exchange your soul anymore.
Yeah.
And that's where like the relationality comes in. Like, how do we restore and rehumanize ourselves from a very dehumanizing system?
Mm. And it reminds me of, when you see it, you can't unsee it. But then if you point it out, everybody else is so conditioned to then see the person pointing out the problem as the crazy one.
That's right.
You know what I mean? Like if you point it out, then you suddenly become like the problem, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of someone like Greta Thunberg, who was the darling in Western media, talking about climate change for years and beautifully articulating why we needed to protect land and care for the earth. And once she started talking about dismantling capitalism and that being like the true problem here, right? The driver of all this violence, right? Ecological violence. Suddenly, Western media was very uninterested in her voice. And I think that that's where, spaces like this and other alternative spaces of media help us get these ideas out there because my view is that Westerners don't want to live this way. They
Yeah.
don't want to live this way. They want to live in a very different kind of world, but it's hard to see um, that there is an out, that there is an outside to this system.
Yeah. Well, and then I think of another like more extreme example even, but do you remember Aaron Bushnell who set himself on
Yes,
fire outside the Israeli
yes,
embassy in
yes.
DC? I mean,
Profound action of just, incredible compassion and sacrifice. And, he makes me think of those Buddhist monks, Tibetan Buddhist monks have done this. Monks in Vietnam did this during the Vietnam War. Like
Yeah,
that
Thich Quang Duc.
self-immolation, yeah, like that's such a powerful form of protest and just such a deep moral clarity that forces us to go, oh my God, what's happening? Let me, think deeper. Like, let me understand this. And we have opportunities in this moment to really divest from the systems that have been harming us all, to varying degrees, but all for centuries.
Talk to me about restoring relationality between native and non-native peoples in North America or wherever. Tell me about like why this matters because this reminds me of whenever I discovered that learning about feminism and embracing feminism could set me free as a guy.
Yes,
You know what I
yes,
mean? So tell me about this restoring of relationality
yeah,
for a better future. Like let's get hopeful here for a second.
yes. No, I love that. We need the hope. Um, you know, when Indigenous peoples and scholars such as myself with Indigenous ancestry are saying, like, how can we restore relations? Like, let's be good relatives to Native and Indigenous people. It can sometimes appear like, oh, well, um, that the whole goal is about uplifting and liberating Indigenous peoples. Well, yes, this is a central goal, but what you sometimes don't realize is that in the process of trying to liberate and empower the most dispossessed people in your society, it inevitably liberates everyone. It liberates everyone because what you have to do is really about interrogating all the systems that keep that dispossession in place, the patriarchy, the misogyny, the transphobia, the racism, right? The naturalized inequity, the commitment to racial capitalism. Once you're able to see, oh, these are actually all the systems of violence, ideologically, but also they become materialized in such a way that we all become ensnared in this sense of distrust, enmity, social chaos, division, and that's a tool of power. That it's a very old tool of power. That goes back to Rome. That's so we see that, oh, as we get socialized into these systems of divide and rule, um, we are disempowering ourselves, right, by being complicit in supporting and celebrating those systems. So when we refuse them, when we disinvest from them, and we begin to work towards um, dismantling racism, misogyny, dismantling forms of violence. I'm thinking about the profound acts of love we've seen in Minneapolis lately, in the way that communities came together to try and protect their neighbors. And again, profound acts of compassion and care, like putting their own lives at risk, right? And especially when white folks were doing that, acting as incredible allies. And so you just see the way that people, I think, intuitively want to love and care for each other. And that's part of the deconditioning. The more we see that, very much like what was happening during civil rights, right? That you had this growing sense of horror and pain among white society in the US going, oh my God, that's the level of violence that African Americans have been experiencing. And then, of course, we saw that in, the 1973 occupation of Wounded Knee directed at the American Indian movement. We saw this at Standing Rock in 2016, 2017. And that epiphany, that kind of moral epiphany is an invitation. It's an invitation to be in relationship, to care, to reach out, to build relations with people, learn about, well, who are the local Native people around me? What is their history? Are they still nearby? Can I build some sort of relationship with them? How can I support them in some way? How can I learn more, just educate myself about that history? There are so many ways that we can build relationship. And I think, you know, it's wide open and that the possibilities when we do that, the possibilities for transforming our world, creating something so radically different. I mean, they're wide open. It's just endless.
To bring us in for a landing, I want to give people some things to look into next, right? So maybe give some suggestions of a couple of things people can read or watch if they find this fascinating, because like I see this as a really great launching point. Um, for me, maybe I need to do a little bit more reading and listening and viewing myself. But where do we go next if people want to continue their thinking on these topics?
I think reading some books by Native and Indigenous scholars to just give us a sense of the history. One that I recommend quite a bit is Vine Deloria Jr.'s books, two of them. God is Red,
Mhm.
which helps us understand the difference between a native worldview, a kind of relational worldview, and then a Western one that's, as he would say, is steeped in like Christianity, but also scientism, right? And that they work together through the colonial project. Another is Custer died for your sins, which helps you understand like the history of Native dispossession. Because again, it's not just that Native people were excluded from this information. All of us were. Like we were socialized to not even think about Native dispossession or genocide. Um, Another that's really great is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's just such a stellar history and contextualization of like, how did we get here? What are all the discourses? She does a really great job of tracing what racial capitalism is, right? Um, Another, of course, is Robin Wall uh, Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is
Yeah.
a beautiful exploration of like relationality, kinship with the other than human world. Um, Another that's really lovely is Becoming Kin by um, Patty Croak, who is essentially saying, like, how do we rebuild kinship between Native and non-Native people? What does it mean? What does kinship mean in a Native context? Why is it important for us to think about? And what does it mean to like restore it among ourselves? It's really key.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to go ahead and add some of those to my Kindle
Yeah.
wish list as well. Um, what are you working on next? Tell us where you're going with this project.
What I'd really like to do, because I've started working with some local Native folks, who are doing things like soil remediation, trying to restore and heal soil using like mushrooms, basically, but also growing medicine to help heal the historical trauma of local Native and Indigenous peoples. And so this project is really about rematriation, meaning how do we restore our relationships to land locally, even in the Denver metro area, which is quite urban, but how do we restore those relationships? How is it that Native and Indigenous peoples are doing that? How is it that they're healing themselves? How is it that they're restoring a sense of sovereignty, kinship, and care, and building it out? I like to think of that as a system of like concentric circles of power, that it radiates out and it interlinks with other local organizations that maybe are non-native, and how do we link these things together to build a very different world?
Amazing. Well, I look forward to hearing from you again. Please come
Yeah,
back on the podcast
yeah,
again in
I
the
will.
future. We need to do like this like every like 18 months kind of thing where we
I'm
like
down.
where we get
Yeah,
together and hang out and talk
we're
about
real.
what you're thinking about, because
Yeah,
I love talking about this topic on the podcast. Like I recently talked about altered states of consciousness with McKeel Van Elk, and that was super fun. And
yeah.
Dr. Liz
His work is
Buchar,
great.
yeah,
Yeah,
and Liz Buchar, she's got an episode coming up where we talk about her experiences,
yeah,
reincorporating the religious element of, psychedelic experiences. And it's just such an interesting topic that just I love talking about this on this
yeah.
show. So thank you for coming on again and chatting with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great. It's so fun to chat with you. Yeah.